I'm Arthur. In the last days of October 2011, one photograph traveled around the entire world. A young fighter in a baseball cap, grinning, mobbed by cheering men, holding a gold-plated pistol above his head. The pistol was reported to be a gift, given to its owner by his own family, and its owner had ruled his country for 42 years. He called himself the brother leader, the guide of the revolution. Kings and presidents had shaken his hand, pitched alongside his famous tent, signed contracts worth billions with him. And on the morning that golden gun changed hands, he was pulled out of a drainage pipe beneath a road, on the edge of the city he had grown up beside. What was done to him in the hour that followed was filmed on a dozen mobile phones. I will tell you about it plainly and carefully when we get there, because it belongs to the record now, and because it is the reason this story has never let go of me. Not out of pity for the man, he earned very little of that, as you are about to hear. It has held on to me because of what that hour revealed, about his people, about the foreign powers who first embraced him and then hunted him, and about what happens to a country when the man who made himself into its spine is torn out of it on camera. Turn the lamp down low if you like, and give me the evening. We begin 40 years before the pipe, in a goat-hair tent in the desert, with a boy who had no shoes. The man in the pipe was Muammar Gaddafi, and for most people alive today he exists as a costume and a punchline. The sunglasses, the robes, the all-female bodyguard, the tent pitched in the parks of foreign capitals, the speeches that ran for hours and followed no map. By the end of his life, television had filed him under eccentric, a strange uncle at the family table of world leaders, and that filing was one of the great category errors of the modern age, because underneath the costume was one of the most durable dictators of the 20th century, a man who took absolute power at 27 and held it for 42 years, longer than most of his people had been alive, a man who hanged students in public squares in front of school children, who had his critics shot in the streets of European cities, whose agents brought down 2 airliners full of civilians, and who ran a prison where more than 1,000 men were machine-gunned in a single morning, and their families were kept in the dark for a decade. And then, in the final act, something stranger than any of it. The same Western governments that had bombed his palace and branded him the most dangerous man on earth invited him back in from the cold, shook his hand, and called it diplomacy. 7 years later, some of those same governments sent their jets to help finish him. And here is the strange thing about how this story is remembered, the thing that convinced me it needed a full evening rather than a clip. Almost everyone above a certain age has seen a few seconds of the ending, the shaky phone footage from the roadside, because for a week in 2011 it was inescapable. Almost nobody has been told the whole road that led there. The school books have no room for him, because he fits none of their shelves. He was a Cold War villain who outlived the Cold War, a terrorist patron who became a Western partner, a socialist who ran a family business the size of a nation, so the memory of him has been left to the footage and the jokes. And the footage and the jokes explain nothing. So the title of tonight's story carries more than one meaning, and I want to lay them all on the table before we begin. What they did to Gaddafi means the hour and the pipe. Yes, the beating and the blood and the meat locker where they laid him out for the crowds. But it also means what his own century did to him, the making of him, because tyrants are built, not born. And it means what was done through him and after him to a country of 6 million people that is still, to this day, paying the bill. By the end of tonight you will know all 3. And you will understand why, when that golden pistol went up in the air outside Sirte, some of the people watching around the world cheered, and some of the wisest of them felt something colder, a kind of dread about what had just been let loose. Hold that dread. It is the thread that runs through everything that follows. He was born in a tent, not a palace tent, not the air-conditioned pavilion he would one day pitch beside the Eiffel Tower, but a real one, woven from goat hair, pitched on the stony desert outside the coastal town of Sirte, in the central waste of Libya. The year was probably 1942, though nobody wrote it down, and even he was never entirely sure. His people were Bedouin herders from a small tribe called the Gaddafi, a tribe with little land, little money, and no influence at all. His father tended camels and goats and moved with the seasons, and the family's world was measured in wells and grazing and the distance to the next rain. To understand the man, you have to understand what Libya was in those years, because the country he was born into barely existed. For 3 decades it had been an Italian colony, and the colonization had been one of the most brutal in Africa. In the 1920s and 30s, Italy's fascist government had crushed Libyan resistance with concentration camps, mass deportations and executions, and food. Historians estimate that a large share of the population of eastern Libya died or was displaced in the process. The worst of it fell on exactly the people Gaddafi came from, the herding tribes of the interior, whose animals were confiscated and whose families were driven behind wire so that the resistance would starve. In the region of Cyrenaica, in the east, historians estimate that tens of thousands died in the camps, of hunger and disease and execution, a share of the population so large that the society there never fully recovered its old shape. This was not ancient history when Gaddafi was a boy. It was the story his elders told about their own lives. The Bedouin of the interior carried that memory the way other nations carry their founding myths. Gaddafi grew up on stories of grandfathers and uncles who had fought the Italians and paid for it, of camps behind wire in the desert, of a resistance leader named Omar Mukhtar who was hanged by the Italians in front of his own people in 1931. Whatever else the boy became, that inheritance was real, and he never stopped reaching for it. Decades later, when he wanted to wound a European government, he would pin a photograph of Mukhtar in chains to his own chest and wear it to state dinners. The Second World War rolled across Libya while he was an infant. When it ended, the exhausted victors handed the territory to the United Nations, and in 1951 Libya was stitched together out of 3 very different provinces and declared an independent kingdom under an elderly, pious, reluctant monarch named King Idris. The new kingdom was one of the poorest countries on the face of the earth. It exported scrap metal from the wartime battlefields and esparto grass and very little else. Most of its people could not read, and the treasury lived on rent from foreign military bases and the charity of foreign aid. King Idris himself was a genuinely reluctant ruler, a religious scholar at heart, most comfortable in the East among the Islamic Brotherhood his family led. He distrusted politics, banned parties within a few years of independence, and let a small circle of courtiers and provincial notables run the state around him. It was a quiet, threadbare, conservative kingdom, and it might have stayed one for a century. And then, in 1959, foreign engineers drilling in the desert found oil, enormous quantities of it, some of the finest and most accessible crude in the world, and everything about Libya's future changed in a decade. By the late 1960s, the kingdom that had lived on scrap metal was one of the significant oil exporters on Earth, and the money was arriving faster than the institutions could honestly absorb it. The money that began to flow did what oil money so often does in a poor country with weak institutions. It pooled at the top. Around the royal court, a class of ministers and fixers and foreign concession holders grew, comfortable, while in the tents and the villages, life stayed almost exactly as it had been for centuries. The boy from the desert saw this happen with his own eyes, at exactly the age when a person's sense of justice is being poured and set. His father scraped together the money to send him to school, first in Sirte, where he was a charity case among town children who mocked the Bedouin boy who slept in the mosque, and later in the southern town of Seba. He was proud, quick, and burning, the first person in his family's living memory to read. And in Seba, a radio changed his life. Every evening, the voice of the Arabs came crackling out of Cairo, carrying the speeches of the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser, the officer who had overthrown a king, faced down Britain and France over the Suez Canal, and preached a single Arab nation, socialist, proud, and free of foreign masters. All over the Arab world, boys of Gaddafi's generation pressed their ears to those broadcasts the way a later generation would stare into screens. Gaddafi did not just listen, he organized. As a teenager, he was leading demonstrations, handing out pamphlets, standing on walls to give speeches against Israel, against the French war in Algeria, against the corruption of the Libyan court. When Syria walked out of its short-lived union with Nasser's Egypt in 1961, the teenager in Seba took it as a personal wound and helped organize protests against the breakup of a country he had never seen. The school eventually expelled him for his politics. He seems to have worn it as a medal. He finished his schooling elsewhere and then made the same calculation Nasser had made before him. In a poor country, there is one institution that feeds you, trains you, arms you, and teaches you how power actually works, and that is the army. In 1963, he entered the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi, and he went in already a conspirator. Inside the academy, he began quietly sorting his fellow cadets, listening for the ones who shared the fire, binding them to him in a secret network he called the Free Officers, in open imitation of Nasser's movement in Egypt. They were young men from poor families, passed over by the aristocratic officer corps, and they swore themselves to a revolution that existed, for years, only in their meetings and their memories. No papers, nothing written down. The army sent him to Britain for further signals training, a season spent among the people who would one day freeze his assets and bomb his home. He walked the streets of London in his Bedouin robes, daring the stairs, and came home more convinced than ever that the Arabs, as he saw it, needed to stop imitating and start overthrowing. By 1969, he was a captain in the Signal Corps, 27 years old, invisible to the palace, unknown to the foreign embassies, and in command of nothing but a network of junior officers and a plan. The kingdom above him was soft, distracted, and led by a king in his late 70s who spent long stretches abroad for his health and had already tried more than once to abdicate. On the 1st of September, 1969, King Idris was out of the country, taking medical treatment in Turkey. Before dawn that morning, the young captain's friends rolled out of their barracks and took the radio stations, the airports, the police headquarters, and the palaces of Tripoli and Benghazi in a matter of hours. It was over almost before it began, with barely a shot fired and almost no blood on the ground. And most Libyans learned about it the way the world did, from the radio. In the first hours of daylight, an unnamed voice came on the air and told the country that the corrupt, backward monarchy was finished, that Libya now belonged to its people, and that a new era of freedom, socialism, and unity had begun. The voice belonged to a 27-year-old nobody from a tent outside Sirte. The world would spend the next 42 years learning his name. The first thing to understand about the coup of 1969 is how popular it was. There were no crowds in the streets defending the king. The old order had been so hollowed out by corruption and indifference that when it fell like a dead tree, and much of the country simply shrugged and waited to see what the young officers would do. What they did in the first years won them real support, and it is a part of the story that deserves to be told honestly. The new Revolutionary Command Council, with Gaddafi at its head, promoted himself to colonel, a rank he would keep theatrically for the rest of his life, while holding power no field marshal ever dreamed of. The young colonel moved fast. Within a year, he had done something no Libyan leader had dared attempt. He forced the United States and Britain to hand over their military bases on Libyan soil, including Huilis Air Base outside Tripoli, one of the largest American air bases outside the United States. The foreign soldiers boarded their planes and left, and to ordinary Libyans, watching a colonial century end in an afternoon, the boy from the tent looked like the answer to a very old prayer. Then he went after the oil. The foreign companies pumping Libya's crude had been taking the lion's share of the profits, as they did everywhere in those days. Gaddafi called their executives in and told them, in effect, that the terms had changed, that Libya could live without oil income longer than the companies could live without Libyan oil. The bluff, if it was a bluff, worked. Libya won itself a dramatically larger share of its own oil wealth, among the earliest and most consequential victories of its kind, and the other producing nations watched carefully and then followed. Within a few years, the world's oil politics had tilted, and the money pouring into Tripoli multiplied beyond anything the kingdom had imagined. To his credit, and I say this deliberately, because this story needs its light to make its darkness legible, a great deal of that money went down instead of up. Hospitals, schools, roads into villages that had never seen asphalt, housing for people who had lived in shanties, electricity for people who had lived by lamplight, literacy campaigns for a nation where most adults could not read. Over the first 2 decades of his rule, life expectancy rose by more than a decade, and Libya climbed toward the highest living standards in Africa. Millions of Libyans got their first concrete house, their first school book, their first paycheck from the state. This is the ledger's other column, and honest history has to record it. But the same years contain the other seed, and you can find it early if you know where to look. Within weeks of taking power, the Revolutionary Command Council banned all political parties. Trade unions were absorbed into the state. Newspapers that questioned the revolution were closed, and their editors learned to write carefully or not at all. The young colonel had risked his life to end a dictatorship of the old and corrupt, and he replaced it, almost by reflex, with a dictatorship of the young and pure. When some of his own fellow officers, men who had made the coup with him, objected to the direction of things in the mid-1970s, they were arrested. Some fled abroad. One of the closest of them, a man who had helped plan the revolution, would later be kidnapped from exile and, by wide reporting, executed. The pattern was set that early, and it never changed for 4 decades. Everything for the people, nothing by the people. He would build them hospitals, but they could not have a newspaper. He would pave their villages, but they could not have a vote that mattered. There was also, in those first years, a dream above Libya itself, and it explains much of what he later became. He had made his revolution as a disciple of Nasser, and he believed, with the whole force of his young certainty, that the Arab states were one nation cut apart by colonial mapmakers, and that his destiny was to weld them back together. He proposed union with Egypt, with Syria, with Sudan, with Tunisia, over the years with nearly every neighbor he had, and treaties of federation were actually signed and celebrated. Every one of them collapsed. Nasser died a year after the coup, and his successor in Cairo, Anwar Sadat, regarded the young Libyan as a reckless boy and turned Egypt toward peace with Israel, which Gaddafi considered the ultimate treason. The Brotherhood curdled into contempt, and in the summer of 1977 the two countries actually fought a short, sharp border war, Egyptian jets striking Libyan airfields before outside mediation stopped it. Rejected by the Arab world he had wanted to lead, he would eventually turn his ambitions south, restyling himself a Pan-African statesman, bankrolling the African Union, and collecting in time the homage of kings. But the sting of those failed unions never left him, and it taught him a lesson he applied at home with terrible thoroughness. If you cannot unify what exists, dissolve it and build your own. In April of 1973, in a speech at the town of Zuwara, he announced what he called a popular revolution, and Libyans learned what the phrase meant in practice. The existing laws were to be suspended. Committees of loyalists would purge the universities, the ministries, and the professions of what he called the politically sick. Books that contradicted the revolution's thinking were pulled from shelves, and in some places burned in public. It was a small-scale rehearsal, a decade early, for the machinery of surveillance and purge that would define the rest of his rule. Even his own revolution was not safe from him. In the mid-1970s, several of the original free officers, the men who had made the coup at his side, concluded that the leader was driving the country toward one-man rule and economic fantasy, and began to push back, and then to plot. The plot was discovered. Some of the plotters escaped into exile, and the man who had led them was eventually lured back years later by wide reporting, handed over from abroad, and never seen again. Others from the original council were sidelined into powerless ministries or quietly retired. Of the 12 young officers who had made the revolution, within a decade only a handful still stood anywhere near power, and only one of them mattered. And in the mind of the man himself, this was not a contradiction at all. Which brings us to the strangest object this story ever produced, a little book with a green cover, and to the moment the revolution stopped being a government and became something closer to a religion. In 1975, the Colonel published a book. It was short, barely 100 pages across its 3 parts, and it was bound in green, the color of Islam, and, from that moment on, the color of the regime. He called it, simply, the Green Book. Inside it, he announced that he had solved the problems of human government, all of them. Parliaments, he wrote, were frauds, a way of stealing the people's voice and handing it to professionals. Political parties were tribes with flags. Elections were theater. In their place he proposed what he called the third universal theory, neither capitalism nor communism, a world where the people governed themselves directly through endless local committees, without politicians, without parties, without a state at all in the old sense. He renamed the country to match. Libya became the Jamahiriya, a word he invented, usually translated as the state of the masses. In March of 1977, the change was made formal. Libya was now, on paper, the only country on earth with no government, ruled directly by its own people through committees and congresses, and Gaddafi, himself, again on paper, held no office whatsoever. He resigned his titles and styled himself simply the brother leader and guide of the revolution, a private citizen with no more constitutional power than a shepherd in the desert. I want you to sit with the audacity of that arrangement, because it was the legal architecture of everything that followed. On paper, nobody was in charge, so nobody could be blamed. In reality, One man controlled the army, the oil, the treasury, the secret police, and the meaning of words, and he had just made himself constitutionally invisible. You cannot vote out a man who holds no office. You cannot impeach a guide. The committees met, thousands of them, up and down the country, and Libyans quickly learned the rules of the game. The people's congresses could debate the price of bread and the paving of a road. They could not debate the leader, the revolution, or the direction of the state. The big decisions arrived from above, from the tent, and the committee's job was to discover that they agreed with them. And alongside the people's committees grew something with real teeth: the revolutionary committees, squads of young zealots answerable to the leader alone, charged with guarding the revolution's purity. They watched the campuses, the barracks, the mosques, the offices. They kept files. They ran the show trials that were soon broadcast on state television. By the early 1980s, by wide reporting, informants for the committees and the security services honeycombed every workplace and every neighborhood in the country. Libyans learned to speak in two languages, a public one for the committees and a private one for the kitchen, and to teach their children, before anything else, which was which. A common saying of those years held that in any gathering of 10 Libyans, at least one was writing a report. The Green Book's economics arrived with the same certainty as its politics, and they landed on ordinary, lifelike weather. Wage labor, the book declared, was a form of slavery, so employees were encouraged to march into their workplaces and declare themselves partners. Rent was exploitation, so in 1978 the regime announced that every house belonged to the person who lived in it, and with a stroke, landlords across Libya lost everything, including widows whose 2 rooms of rental income had been a pension. Retail trade was parasitic, so over the following years private shops were shuttered by the thousands, replaced by state supermarkets with long queues and empty shelves. Savings above a modest ceiling were effectively confiscated in a sudden currency exchange. A merchant class that had taken generations to grow was erased in a few seasons, and the people who knew how to run things left the country in their tens of thousands, taking their competence with them. The oil money papered over the failure for years, buying the imports the dead economy could no longer produce. But something in the country's spirit went brittle in that decade, because a nation where no one may build anything of their own is a nation where everyone is waiting. The man at the center, meanwhile, was floating free of the ordinary world. He received foreign guests in a Bedouin tent pitched on the lawns of his compound, with camels grazing outside, theater and sincerity in proportions no visitor could untangle. He surrounded himself with a corps of female bodyguards the foreign press could not stop photographing. His motorcades grew, his uniforms grew, his titles grew, and his speeches stretched for hours, wandering from oil prices to the abolition of Switzerland. The cult grew with the fear. His portrait hung in every shop and every classroom, over every road, on the front page of every newspaper, at the top of every broadcast. The Green Book was taught in the schools, quoted in the courts, broadcast from a dedicated study center, carved in concrete on the roadsides. Foreign visitors described whole cities where it was difficult, standing in a public square, to find a sightline that did not include his face. He was becoming, in his own mind, not the ruler of Libya but its essence. And the essence of a nation does not share power, and it does not retire. It also does not forgive, because in the same years the committees were hanging his portrait in the classrooms, they began hanging something else there too. On the 7th of April, 1976, students at the universities of Tripoli and Benghazi did something that had quietly become unthinkable. They held demonstrations against the Revolutionary Committee's grip on their campuses, demanding free student unions, elections, a sliver of the freedom the revolution had promised them. The regime let the anniversary come around once, and then it answered. On the 7th of April, 1977, 1 year to the day after the protests, students were hanged in public in Benghazi with crowds summoned to watch. It was the beginning of a tradition, and I use that word deliberately because the regime itself did. For years afterward, the 7th of April was marked in Libya the way other countries mark harvest festivals, with public executions of students, dissidents, and defectors, some of them carried out on the university campuses themselves, gallows erected where the lecture notes had been. State television broadcast them. School children were brought on buses. There is one execution from those years that Libyans of a certain age still cannot speak about steadily, and I will tell it to you as plainly and briefly as I can. In June of 1984, a young aeronautical engineer named Al-Sadek Hamed al-Shuwedi, who had recently returned from his studies in the United States and been accused of joining the opposition, was brought into a packed basketball stadium in Benghazi. The stands were full, and among the thousands watching, many were students who had been bussed in for the occasion. He was tried there, in the arena, by a revolutionary court, sobbing and hanged in front of the crowd, and the broadcast went out live to the nation. Witnesses and the wide reporting that followed describe a young woman from the Revolutionary Committees rushing forward and pulling on his legs to finish the work. She was later rewarded with high office, and Libyans gave her a name for it that followed her for the rest of her career. The point of the spectacle was not justice. The point was that everyone watching, in the hall and at home, should understand that there was no floor, no line, no place the regime would not go, and the regime's reach did not stop at the border. In 1980, Gaddafi's government began publicly demanding that Libyans living abroad, students, businessmen, exiles, come home and submit to the revolution. Those who refused were declared stray dogs. That was the official phrase, and the Revolutionary Committees announced openly a campaign for what they called the physical liquidation of the enemies of the revolution abroad. It was not rhetoric. That same year, exiled critics of the regime began dying in the capitals of Europe and the Middle East. A lawyer shot in his office in London, a businessman gunned down in Rome, a journalist, a broadcaster, an economist, one by one, in Athens and Bonn and Beirut, more than a dozen in the first wave by most counts, killed in daylight, in public, by teams that melted away. The message crossed borders faster than the bullets. There is no exile. There is no abroad. There is nowhere the tent cannot see you. Even honored guests were not safe, and one disappearance from those years still poisons an entire relationship between nations. In August of 1978, one of the most revered Shia clerics in the world, the Lebanese Imam Musa al-Sadr, flew to Libya at the regime's invitation with 2 companions, was seen in Tripoli, and then simply ceased to exist. Libya insisted for decades that he had left for Rome, and no credible evidence ever supported it. Lebanon still marks the anniversary. The case has outlived the regime, the revolution, and very nearly everyone involved, and it has never been solved. Then, in April of 1984, the campaign produced one of those moments that permanently change how a country is seen. In London, Libyan exiles gathered in St. James's Square to demonstrate outside their country's embassy, which the regime had renamed the Libyan People's Bureau. British police officers stood between the protesters and the building, among them a 25-year-old constable named Yvonne Fletcher. At about 10:20 in the morning, automatic gunfire came from a first-floor window of the embassy, raking the square. 11 demonstrators were wounded. Yvonne Fletcher was struck and died shortly afterward, and she died as a police officer on duty in her own capital, shot from inside a foreign embassy. Britain laid siege to the building for 11 days, then expelled everyone inside under diplomatic immunity and severed relations with Libya entirely. No one was ever brought to trial for her murder. Her hat lay in the square where she fell, in front of the news cameras, and that image did as much as any intelligence briefing to fix, in the Western mind, what the Libyan revolution had become. By the middle of the 1980s, then, the boy from the tent had made himself the essence of a nation and the nightmare of its neighbors. But he had not yet become what the American president would soon call him, the most dangerous man in the world. That required a bigger stage and bigger bombs, and it is where we go next, into the decade when Libya and the West went to war in everything but name, and airliners full of ordinary people paid the price. Through the 1970s and 80s, Gaddafi poured oil money into armed movements across the world. Some of it went to causes with broad support in the global South, anti-colonial movements, anti-apartheid fighters, and this is why, decades later, some African and Middle Eastern leaders would still speak of him warmly. But a great deal of it went to groups that planted bombs in department stores and airports, and he was not particular about the difference. By the mid-1980s, Western intelligence services tied Libyan money, weapons, or training to militant groups on 4 continents. Among the best documented of his clients was the Irish Republican Army, which received shipments of Libyan rifles and explosives across the 1980s, arms that fed a conflict 2,000 miles from Tripoli for years. The American government put Libya on its founding list of state sponsors of terrorism. He fought neighbors as well as shadows. For most of the 1980s, Libyan troops occupied and fought over the northern strip of Chad, the country to the south, in a grinding desert war that ended in 1987 in one of the most lopsided defeats of the era. Chadian forces in light pickup trucks, moving fast across ground the Libyan armor could not read, destroyed whole Libyan columns and bases in a few weeks, and thousands of Libyan soldiers never came home. The war was unpopular, unexplained, and largely unmourned by the state that had spent its conscripts on it, and Libyan families quietly added it to the ledger. With America, the confrontation ran through the waters of the Mediterranean. Gaddafi had drawn a line across the Gulf of Sidra, declared everything south of it Libyan water in defiance of international law, and called it the Line of Death. The American Navy made a point of crossing it year after year, and in a series of clashes through the early and mid-1980s, Libyan jets and patrol boats that challenged the fleet were shot out of the sky and sunk. The confrontation kept escalating through expelled diplomats and frozen assets until the 5th of April, 1986. That night, in West Berlin, a bomb went off in a discotheque called La Belle, a place known to be full of off-duty American soldiers. 3 people were killed, 2 of them American servicemen, and around 230 were wounded. American and British intelligence intercepted messages between Tripoli and the Libyan mission in East Berlin, first setting up the attack and then reporting its success back home. For the American president, Ronald Reagan, who had already called Gaddafi the mad dog of the Middle East, the intercepts were the proof he had been waiting for. 9 days later, on the 15th of April, American bombers struck Tripoli and Benghazi in the middle of the night, hitting military targets, the airport, and Gaddafi's own compound at Bab al-Azizia, where he lived and worked. Gaddafi survived, reportedly warned minutes ahead. Dozens of Libyans died in the raids. The regime announced to the world that among the dead was a baby girl, Hannah, whom Gaddafi had adopted, though foreign journalists came to question that account in later years, and the truth of it has never been settled. What is certain is that the man himself emerged from the rubble transformed, in his own telling, from a revolutionary into a survivor of an American assassination attempt, and his appetite for revenge did not shrink. What came next is the crime for which the world remembers him most. 4 days before Christmas, on the 21st of December, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747 named Clipper Maid of the Seas, took off from London bound for New York. It carried 259 people, many of them Americans flying home for the holidays, including a group of university students returning from a semester abroad. 38 minutes after takeoff, over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, a bomb, hidden in a suitcase in the forward cargo hold, tore the aircraft apart at 31,000 feet. All 259 people on board were killed. Wreckage and burning fuel fell onto the town itself, destroying houses on a street called Sherwood Crescent, and 11 residents of Lockerbie died on the ground. 270 people from 21 countries. Investigators spent years crawling over the hills of southern Scotland, reassembling the aircraft fragment by fragment in a hangar, and the trail they followed, a timer circuit board, a suitcase, a shirt traced to a shop in Malta, led to Libyan intelligence. 2 Libyan agents were indicted. And 9 months after Lockerbie, in September of 1989, a French airliner, UTA Flight 772, was brought down by a suitcase bomb over the desert of Niger, killing all 170 people aboard. A French court would later convict 6 Libyans for it in absentia, among them a senior intelligence officer married into Gaddafi's own circle. Taken together, the 2 bombings killed 440 civilians. The United Nations responded with something Libya had never faced: comprehensive international sanctions, cutting the country off from air travel, arms, and oil equipment until it handed over the Lockerbie suspects. Gaddafi refused for years. The 1990s became Libya's locked decade. The oil economy corroded. Parts for planes, hospitals, and refineries dried up. The regime survived. Sanctions rarely kill regimes, but the country stagnated, and the leader, entering his 50s, found himself exactly where his enemies wanted him: boxed in, aging, and running out of moves. And it was in that locked decade, away from the world's cameras, inside a prison in Tripoli, that his men committed the crime that would, 15 years later, come back and end him. The world barely noticed it at the time. Libyans never forgot it.
On the southern
edge of Tripoli stood a prison called Abu Salim. It was the regime's warehouse for its political prisoners, the Islamists and the students and the professionals and the men who had said one sentence too many in the wrong room. Some had trials, many did not. Men disappeared into Abu Salim and simply stopped. No sentence, no release date, no letters. Torture there was, by the consistent testimony of survivors, ordinary in both senses of the word, routine and unremarkable. Food was scarce, medicine scarcer, and years could pass without a family knowing whether the name they prayed for belonged to a living man. At the end of June 1996, the prisoners reached the end of what they could bear. On the evening of the 28th, a group of them seized a guard during the meal round and took control of parts of the prison. What they demanded, by the account of survivors, was almost unbearably modest: clean clothes, time outside the cells, medical care, trials, or at least visits from their families. Regime officials came to the prison that night and negotiated, and among them, by multiple accounts, was the head of intelligence, one of the leader's closest men. The prisoners were promised that their demands would be considered and the sick would be treated. In the morning, hundreds of prisoners were moved out into the courtyards. At around 11 o'clock in the morning, on the 29th of June, a grenade was thrown into one of the courtyards, and then, from the rooftops around them, security men opened fire on the penned crowds with automatic weapons. The shooting went on, by survivor accounts, for the better part of 2 hours. A former prisoner who worked in the kitchen, and who later gave his testimony to human rights investigators, described counting the meals he no longer needed to prepare. By that count, and by the estimate that human rights organizations still use, about 1,270 men were killed in and around those courtyards in a single morning. The bodies went into trenches and, later, by wide reporting, into refrigerated trucks and unmarked graves. And then the regime did something that tells you more about its nature than the shooting itself. It said nothing. Not to the world, which it could perhaps have ignored, but to the mothers. For years afterward, families kept traveling to Tripoli, with food parcels and clean clothes and money, and standing at the gates of Abu Salim and handing the parcels to the guards and asking after their sons. And the guards took the parcels for dead men year after year, and sometimes passed back a message. He is well. He thanks you. He asks for cigarettes. What I keep coming back to in this part of the story is the bookkeeping of that cruelty. Somebody administered it. Somebody logged the parcels year after year for more than 1,000 men who existed only as a lie the state was telling their mothers, and nobody in that long chain of somebody's ever found the silence unbearable enough to break it. Regimes are not held together by their believers. They are held together by their clerks. Some families did not learn the truth for over a decade. In the 2000s, as we will see, the regime began quietly issuing death certificates, many with no cause of death, no date, no body, no grave. In Benghazi, in the east, where a great many of the murdered men had come from, the families organized, and a young lawyer took their case, filing suits, demanding answers, standing with the mothers and their photographs outside the courthouses. His name was Fathi Turbil. Hold on to that name. In February of 2011, the regime will arrest him one more time, and that arrest will light the fire that burns all the way to the drainage pipe. But before we get there, the story takes the turn that even the people who study dictators for a living did not see coming. The West decided to forgive him. The bargaining began quietly at the end of the 1990s. Sanctions had aged the regime, the oil fields needed Western technology, and the leader, now in his late 50s, had watched his revolution curdle into isolation. Slowly, through intermediaries, deals took shape. One of the intermediaries was a man whose word almost no one on earth would question. Nelson Mandela, who had not forgotten that Libya armed and funded the struggle against apartheid when Western governments were still calling his movement terrorists, visited Tripoli, embraced its leader in front of the cameras, and told his critics plainly that he would not abandon a friend of that struggle. It was Mandela, as much as any diplomat, who helped broker the arrangement that finally moved the Lockerbie case forward, and the moment tells you something the Western telling of this story often leaves out. In much of Africa, the man was never only a monster. In 1999, under that arrangement, Libya handed over the 2 Lockerbie suspects for trial before Scottish judges sitting in the Netherlands. One of them, an intelligence officer named Abdelbasit al-Megrahi, was convicted of the 270 murders and sentenced to life. The other was acquitted. In 2003, Libya formally accepted responsibility for the bombing and agreed to pay compensation to the families, in the end some $2.7 billion, roughly $10 million for every life. In September of that year, the United Nations lifted its sanctions. Then came the announcement that stunned even the diplomats. On the 19th of December 2003, Libya declared that it had been secretly pursuing weapons of mass destruction, including a nuclear weapons program, and that it was giving all of it up voluntarily and inviting international inspectors in to verify the dismantling. Months of secret talks with Britain and America had preceded it, begun in part by the leader's own son. In the same season, American tanks were rolling into Iraq. Rwandan, the timing was not a coincidence, and nobody pretended otherwise. Gaddafi had watched another dictator, Saddam Hussein, defy the West over weapons of mass destruction, and by the end of that December, Saddam was being pulled out of a hole in the ground near Tikrit by American soldiers. The lesson, as Tripoli appeared to read it, was that the weapons drew the invasion. Give them up, and you buy safety. The West rushed to reward the convert. In March of 2004, the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, flew to Libya and shook Gaddafi's hand in his tent outside Tripoli, the first British leader to visit since the coup. Oil contracts followed within hours of the handshake. Other leaders followed the same road in the following years, and the man whose agents had shot a police officer in London and blown an American airliner out of the sky was received in Paris and Rome, his tent pitched in the gardens of the republics that had once frozen his accounts. If you want a single story that captures what the new partnership was willing to swallow, consider the one Europe watched for 8 years with its teeth gritted. In 1999, Libya arrested 5 Bulgarian nurses and a Palestinian doctor working at a hospital in Benghazi and charged them with deliberately infecting hundreds of Libyan children with HIV. The evidence was worthless. The confessions were extracted under torture by the defendant's consistent account, and the world's leading AIDS researchers testified that the infections traced to hospital hygiene failures that predated the nurses' arrival. Libyan courts sentenced the 6 to death anyway, twice. They spent more than 8 years in prison, while the new friend of the West used them, openly, as bargaining chips, and they were finally flown home in 2007 after European governments arranged payments to the victims' families and a bundle of agreements. The children's infections were real, and hundreds of families carried that grief. The regime's answer had been to torture foreign scapegoats rather than admit its hospitals were broken, and Europe's answer had been to keep signing. There was more in the same ledger. In 2008, Italy signed a friendship treaty with Tripoli, promising billions in investment as colonial compensation, and in exchange came cooperation on migration, with boats intercepted at sea and people returned to Libyan detention, out of Europe's sight and off Europe's conscience. In 2009, the Lockerbie bomber himself, dying of cancer, was released from his Scottish prison on compassionate grounds, escorted home by the leader's son, and received at the airport in Tripoli by cheering, flag-waving crowds. The families of the 270 watched that homecoming on the news. The rebranding reached its strangest heights at the end of the decade. In 2008, at a gathering in Benghazi, a crowd of African traditional rulers proclaimed him the King of Kings of Africa. In 2009, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly for the first time, was scheduled for 15 minutes, and spoke for more than 90, tearing a copy of the UN Charter as he went. The world's press covered it as comedy, the eccentric uncle again, and the coverage rarely mentioned Abu Salim or the gallows in the sports hall, because officially, now, he was a partner. Inside Libya, the years of the handshake were sold as the years of reform, and the face of that promise was the leader's second son, Saif al-Islam. Educated in Europe, fluent, tailored, holding a doctorate from the London School of Economics, Saif told every interviewer that Libya was changing, opening, liberalizing. Some political prisoners were released. Compensation was quietly discussed for the Abu Salim families, and death certificates began to appear. But the committees still watched, the prisons still held their men, and no election was any nearer than it had been in 1977. The reform was a coat of paint on a structure whose load-bearing walls were fear, patronage, and one aging man's certainty that he was the nation itself. By 2010, that man was 68 years old, had ruled for 41 years, and was grooming his sons while his people, more than half of them under 30, watched satellite television and the internet and understood, with perfect clarity, what they did not have. If you have stayed with me this far into the evening, and you find that these long, patient tellings are the way you like your history, this is the natural place for me to mention, quietly, that a subscribe is what tells me to keep making them. That is the whole appeal, and I will not interrupt the story again, because the fuse we have been following since the courtyards of Abu Salim is about to reach the powder. Across the border to the west, in Tunisia, in December of 2010, a street vendor set himself on fire in front of a government building, and the Arab world caught. Within weeks, the president of Tunisia had fled his country. Within a month, the crowds owned the squares of Cairo, and the president of Egypt, 30 years in power, was falling. And in Libya, the families of Abu Salim, and a generation raised under one portrait, leaned toward their screens. On the 15th of February 2011, the regime made the mistake that historians will be examining for a century. With protests spreading across the Arab world, the security services in Benghazi decided to get ahead of trouble by arresting the man they saw as a ringleader. They took Fathi Terbil, the young lawyer of the Abu Salim families. They could not have chosen a worse target. Within hours, the mothers and widows and brothers of the massacred prisoners were outside police headquarters in Benghazi, demanding his release, and the crowd around them grew by the hour. The regime released Terbil quickly, but it no longer mattered. The families had been standing at locked gates for 15 years, and the whole city knew it, and the crowds stopped being about one lawyer and started being about everything. Activists had already called for a day of rage on the 17th of February, the anniversary of an earlier crackdown. When it came, the security forces did what they had been built to do and fired on the crowds. But this time the crowds did not scatter. They buried their dead and came back larger, and within days the uprising had taken Benghazi, and the east of the country was simply no longer his. What made Libya different from Tunisia and Egypt was the answer from the top. The army did not stand aside, because there was no real army in the national sense, only units built around loyalty, sons and tribes. The regime's response was announced by the leader's own son, Saif al-Islam, the reformer, the doctorate from London, went on television and told his countrymen that rivers of blood would flow, that Libya was not Tunisia or Egypt, and that the regime would fight to the last bullet. And then something happened that 40 years of committees had been built to prevent. The regime began to shed its own people. The justice minister resigned in protest at the shooting of demonstrators and went east to join the rebellion, where he would soon lead its national council. The interior minister, one of the oldest companions of the revolution, defected and called on the army to follow him. Diplomats resigned at the United Nations, at the Arab League, in embassies across 3 continents. some of them denouncing their leader on live television. And in the most cinematic defection of all, 2 Libyan Air Force pilots, ordered to bomb their own countrymen, flew their jets across the water to Malta instead and asked for asylum. Each defection told the crowds the same thing. The regime was not a mountain, it was a crust, and it was cracking. 2 days later, the father spoke and produced one of the strangest and most consequential speeches ever given by a head of state. Standing in the bombed ruin of the Bab al-Azizia compound, the ruin he had preserved for a quarter century as a monument to American aggression, he pounded the lectern and told the crowds what he thought of them. He was not a president who could resign, he said. He was the revolution itself, the glory of Libya, and he would die on its soil as a martyr. The protesters, he said, were rats and cockroaches, drugged and paid by foreigners, and he would hunt them from the country inch by inch, room by room, home by home, alleyway by alleyway. In Libyan dialect, alleyway is zenga, zenga, zenga. Within days, a remix of the speech, set to a dance beat, was being watched millions of times across the Arab world. The dictator turned literally into a song, and I can think of no image that captures the end of fear more precisely than that. But the speech was not only absurd, it was a promise, and his forces set about keeping it. Through late February and early March, the regime counterattacked along the coast road, city by city, with tanks, artillery, and aircraft. By the middle of March, loyalist armor stood at the gates of Benghazi, a city of nearly 700,000 people, and the leader's spokesmen were promising that the rebels would be hunted house to house and that no mercy waited for those who did not surrender. The world, which had watched Rwanda and Srebrenica happen on live television within living memory, believed him. On the 17th of March, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing member states to take all necessary measures to protect Libyan civilians and imposing a no-fly zone. 2 days later, French jets were over Benghazi, striking the armored columns at the city's edge, and American and British missiles began dismantling Libya's air defenses. Within weeks, the operation passed to NATO command. I am not going to pretend the intervention is a simple story, because it is not, and the argument about it has never ended. Its defenders say it stopped a massacre at Benghazi that had been promised out loud. Its critics point out that a mandate to protect civilians became in practice the air force of one side in a civil war, and that the men authorizing the bombs had been shaking the leader's hand 2 years earlier. Both of those things can be true at once, and tonight I only ask you to hold them, because you cannot understand the pipe outside Sirte without them. Through the spring and summer of 2011, the war ground back and forth along the coast. The regime besieged the rebel city of Misrata for months, shelling its port and its neighborhoods with artillery and rockets, and Misrata came out of that siege having buried its dead by the hundreds upon hundreds, carrying a hatred of the regime that will matter very much at the end of this story. NATO flew thousands of strike missions. The frozen front lines began, slowly, to move. In June, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for crimes against humanity for the shooting of unarmed demonstrators in the first days of the uprising. 3 names were on the warrants: the leader himself, his son Saif al-Islam, and his brother-in-law, the intelligence chief who had, by the accounts we heard earlier, stood in the courtyards of Abu Salim. For the first time in 42 years, a court somewhere was formally asking for him. And in August, the end came fast. Rebel columns broke out of the western mountains. The coastal towns rose one after another, and in the 3rd week of August, the fighters entered Tripoli itself. The compound at Bab al-Azizia, stormed at last, gave up its secrets, the underground tunnels, the gilded absurdities, the private luxuries of a family that had owned a nation. Crowds climbed the monuments and carried off the souvenirs of 42 years, but the man himself was not there. Sometime in those August days, as his capital fell, Muammar Gaddafi slipped out of Tripoli in a small convoy and vanished. The rebels held the cities, the world recognized their council as Libya's new government, and for 2 months the first question of every morning was the same: where is he? He had gone home. Of all the places in Libya a hunted man might hide, the fallen leader chose Sirte, the modest coastal city he had raised from a fishing town into a showpiece, the place nearest the tent he was born in. His son Muammar, a soldier and once his national security advisor, organized the defense. Perhaps a few hundred loyalist fighters, in a city already filling with refugees from the war, prepared to hold it against the new Libya. The men who came to take Sirte were, in large part, the brigades of Misrata, the city the regime had besieged and shelled through the spring. They came with artillery of their own, and with NATO overhead, and the battle for Sirte became the longest and ugliest of the whole war. Through September and into October, the front crawled block by block, and the city that was supposed to be the regime's monument was ground into gray rubble around its defenders. The civilians of Sirte paid the way civilians always pay. Tens of thousands fled along the coast road with what they could carry, and the ones who stayed, out of loyalty or fear or simple inability to leave, lived for weeks in basements without power or clean water, under shell fire from the men liberating them. When the aid organizations finally reached the hospital, they found it wrecked, its wards hit, its staff fled, its patients dying of treatable wounds. Whatever the flags flying over them, the last weeks of Sirte belong on the same shelf as the sieges the old regime had inflicted. By the first week of October, what remained of the loyalist force was compressed into one neighborhood of a few hundred meters, a district called Number 2, under fire from 3 sides. And inside that shrinking square of broken buildings, unknown to the men bombarding it, was the most wanted human being on earth. The world, meanwhile, heard only his voice. Through the autumn, defiant audio messages attributed to him surfaced through a sympathetic foreign broadcaster, calling on Libyans to rise against the traitors and the crusaders, insisting he was still on Libyan soil and would fight to the end. Analysts argued over where the recordings were made. Nobody guessed that the voice was coming from an abandoned house with no electricity, in a city the speaker could not leave. We know what those last weeks looked like from the inside, because some of the men who lived them survived to be interviewed, among them Mansour Dow, the commander of the People's Guard, who stayed beside the leader to the end. His account, given to journalists and human rights investigators from a Misrata prison, is one of the most extraordinary documents of the whole story. The man who had owned a nation's oil for 4 decades spent his final weeks moving between abandoned houses every few days, without electricity, often without running water, living on scraps of rice and pasta scavenged by his guards. By Dow's account, the leader passed the days reading, making tea on a charcoal stove, and complaining about the lack of electricity and water, as if the utilities of the city being demolished around him were someone else's responsibility. He spent hours with a satellite phone that mostly could not get through, and the calls NATO was listening for would eventually help find him. He talked about the betrayals of the tribes, of the people, of the foreigners who had shaken his hand. Those around him, Dow said, urged him again and again to slip away, to the desert, to the border, and he refused, saying he would die in the land of his ancestors. I keep returning to one detail of that account, and I offer it to you as texture, not as sympathy. In those last days, the man who had renamed the country, rewritten its calendar, and hanged its students, appears to have genuinely not understood why it was happening. Dow described him as bewildered, asking why there was no electricity, why there was no water, why his people had turned. The committees and the portraits and the informers had done their work so well for so long that at the end, the only Libyan who still believed in the Jamahiriya was its author. By the 19th of October, District 2 was a few blocks of rubble under constant fire, and the wounded were dying for lack of any care. The decision was made to break out at dawn and run for the countryside toward the valley of Jarif, where the leader's family had roots and the tribes might shelter him. A convoy was assembled in the dark, every vehicle that would still drive, something on the order of 75 cars and trucks loaded with fighters, wounded men, ammunition, and one 69-year-old passenger in a khaki uniform. They left it too late in the morning. At around 8:30 on the 20th of October 2011, the convoy came roaring out of District 2 into the open, in daylight, under a sky that belonged entirely to its enemies. What happened in the next 2 hours is the reason this video carries the title it does. The convoy never had a chance, and it is worth being precise about why. NATO had been listening for the leader's satellite phone for weeks, and surveillance aircraft were stacked over Sirte that morning. A column of 75 vehicles moving at speed in open daylight was not an escape, it was a signature. A few kilometers west of the city, the first missile came down among the cars, fired from an American Predator drone, and French jets followed with heavier bombs. The convoy shattered into groups. Vehicles burned, ammunition cooked off, and men who had survived 2 months of siege died in the open in seconds. Human rights investigators who walked the site a day later counted more than 50 bodies among the wreckage, many burned beyond recognition. Gaddafi's own group survived the strikes. His car was disabled, and with perhaps 24 men, some wounded, he went on foot through a grove of trees and a sandy field toward the road. There, running out of world, the man who had ruled Libya for 42 years crawled with his guards into a concrete drainage pipe beneath the highway. The Misrata fighters found them within the hour. There was a short, hopeless firefight around the pipes, grenades, and rifle fire, and then the men inside began to surrender. And out of the pipe, filthy, bleeding from a wound to his head, dazed by the blast of a grenade, came a face every fighter on that road had grown up underneath. By the accounts of the men who were there, he asked them questions. What is happening? What did I do to you? Do you know right from wrong? There is video of much of what followed, filmed by the fighters themselves on their phones, and it went around the world within hours. I am going to describe it the way the human rights record describes it, briefly and without relish. He was mobbed, dragged, and beaten by a crowd of fighters as he was moved toward the vehicles, bleeding heavily, pleading. He was struck with rifle butts and boots and fists, and he was stabbed and violated in ways that I am not going to detail in this telling, because you do not need the images, and the record has them if you ever choose to look. The videos show him alive, upright, and begging when he reached the trucks. He was hauled onto the hood of a truck, then toward an ambulance bound up the coast for Misrata, and the videos from that morning show him passed from crowd to crowd, each phone recording its piece of the last hour. Some time later, he was dead. The fighters who took him said afterward that he was killed in crossfire on the road to Misrata, and almost no one who has examined the evidence believes it. The reported autopsy found that he died of a gunshot, and human rights investigators after reconstructing his last 90 minutes from the videos and the witnesses, concluded that he almost certainly died in the custody of the men who had captured him. To this day, no one has ever been charged. It was in the crush around the pipe that the golden pistol from the beginning of our evening changed hands, pulled from the prisoner or his baggage in the scrum and lifted over a young fighter's head, and within hours the photograph of that moment was on front pages on every continent. The fighter was reported to be about 20 years old. He had not yet been born when the man whose gun he was waving marked his 20th year in power. News of the death reached the American Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, in the middle of a television interview, and the cameras caught her reaction. "We came, we saw, he died," she said, and laughed. I leave that moment in the story without comment, except to say that governments are usually more careful than that about how they greet a killing no court has examined, and the carelessness itself is part of the record now. His son Muammar, who had led the defense of Sirte, was captured alive in the same breakout, lightly wounded. There is video of him too, sitting in a room in Misrata, smoking a cigarette, drinking water, looking at his captors with a kind of exhausted contempt. By that evening he was dead as well, with wounds that had not been there in the footage. The old defense minister, Abu Bakr Yunus, one of the original officers of 1969, died in the breakout too. And there is one more piece of that day that the world's cameras mostly missed, and that I will not leave out, because it is the part the human rights record insists on. The Misrata brigades took dozens of prisoners from the convoy that morning. In the days that followed, investigators found the bodies of at least 66 of them at a hotel nearby, in the garden, on the grass, some with their hands still tied behind their backs. Whatever that morning was, it was not justice, and the men who did it were never charged either. The leader's body was driven to Misrata, the city his army had besieged, and there the new Libya did something that tells you how deep the wound went. They laid him out on a mattress in a commercial meat locker next to his son, and they opened the doors. For 4 days, thousands of ordinary Libyans queued in the parking lot. Families, old men, children lifted on shoulders, filing past the refrigerated shelves to look at him. Some prayed, some cursed, most simply looked for a long moment at the face from the portraits, needing to see it still. Officials talked for a while about a grave site, a family plot, a proper procedure. In the end, before dawn on the 25th of October, a small group took the bodies of Gaddafi, his son, and his defense minister out into the desert and buried them at a location that has never been revealed, so that there would never be a shrine or a rallying point or a place to lay flowers. The man who had built his face into every wall of a nation was placed in ground that no map marks. 3 days earlier, the new government had stood in Benghazi, where it all began, and declared Libya liberated. Around the world, the reaction split along a line that has never closed. Crowds celebrated in Tripoli and Benghazi, and some of the relatives of the Lockerbie dead spoke of a debt partly paid. But the United Nations Human Rights Office and the very organizations that had documented his crimes for decades called for an investigation into his death, and lawyers pointed out the obvious, that the summary killing of a captured prisoner is a war crime, whoever the prisoner is. The new government promised an inquiry. Nothing ever came of it. And here is the question I have carried through every telling of this story, and that I now hand to you. On the morning they pulled him from the pipe, Libya held in its hands the man who knew everything, where the money was, who gave the orders at Abu Salim, what was promised, and by whom, in the tents and the private meetings with the presidents and prime ministers of the West. The trial, at The Hague or in Tripoli, would have put 42 years of the regime's secrets and the West's into the record under oath in front of the mothers of Benghazi. That trial died in the pipe with him. Some of the people who study these things have wondered out loud ever since how many powerful men in how many capitals quietly exhaled when they learned there would never be a witness stand. I do not know the answer. I only know that the men with the phones filmed everything except the moment itself, and that the question has outlived everyone it embarrasses. If this were a fable, it would end at the pipe, with the tyrant fallen and the people free. It is not a fable, and I owe you the rest, because what happened to Libya after the pipe is the second half of the haunting. The country that woke up on the 21st of October 2011 had oil, a small population, no debt to speak of, and the goodwill of half the world. What it did not have was a single institution that could stand on its own, because the Jamahiriya had been designed deliberately so that nothing could stand except the man at the center. No real parliament, no real parties, no independent courts, no national army, nothing between the tent and the tribes. He had hollowed the state for 42 years so that no rival could ever grow in it, and when he fell, the hollow is what remained. Into that hollow stepped the militias, the brigades that had won the war, from Misrata, from Zintan, from 100 towns, did not disarm, and the weapons of the regime's arsenals, whole warehouses of rifles and missiles, flowed into the country and across its borders, arming conflicts as far away as Mali and Syria. And yet, for a moment, it looked as if the story might turn out well, and honesty requires that moment be told too. In July of 2012, Libyans voted in their first free national election in 6 decades, and they did it with a joy that moved even the hardened correspondents covering it. Old men wept at ballot boxes. Women who had never been asked their opinion about anything public inked their fingers and photographed them. The moderates won. Power was handed over peacefully, and for about a year, Libya looked like the Arab Spring's quiet success story. It did not hold. The warnings came early. In September of 2012, less than a year after the pipe, militants attacked the American diplomatic compound in Benghazi and killed 4 Americans, among them the ambassador, a man who had slipped into Libya during the uprising to support the revolution. The city where the revolution was born was already slipping out of anyone's control. By 2014, Libya had split into 2 rival governments, one in the west and one in the east, each with its own armies and parliaments and foreign sponsors, and the second civil war began. Into the chaos came the worst actors on earth. For a year and a half, the black flag of the Islamic State flew over Sirte, of all places, the leader's hometown, its fighters staging executions on the same seafront the regime had built for its parades. It took another siege and another storm of foreign air power to drive them out, and the city that had already been destroyed once was destroyed again. The wars that followed stopped being Libyan at all. An Eastern warlord, a general who had once served the regime and then broken with it decades before, marched on Tripoli in 2019, and the fighting drew in drones from one foreign power, mercenaries from another, money from half a dozen more, each feeding its own proxy for its own reasons. The country with Africa's largest proven oil reserves became a board on which other nations played. And in 2023, the hollowness stopped being a metaphor. A storm dumped rain on the eastern mountains, and above the coastal city of Derna, 2 dams that had gone unmaintained through decades of dictatorship and a decade of chaos gave way in the night. A wall of water went through the sleeping city and carried whole neighborhoods into the sea, and the dead were counted in the thousands, with estimates running far higher. The dams had needed repair since before the revolution. There had simply never, in all those years, under all those flags, been a state to do it. And then there is the part that, for me, closes the circle in the darkest way possible. With no state on the coast, Libya became the funnel for hundreds of thousands of desperate people from across Africa trying to reach Europe, and the militias discovered that human beings were a commodity like fuel or guns. In 2017, journalists filmed something that most of the world assumed had left the earth a century ago, an auction at night outside Tripoli, where young men were being sold as laborers for a few $100s each. Slave markets in the 21st century, on the Mediterranean, in the ruins of the state the world had bombed open and then walked away from. The family's story wound down in the same shadows. Several of the sons died in the war or its aftermath. Others fled abroad, into exile in Algeria and Oman, into the discreet silence of the Gulf. The intelligence chief, the third name on the international warrants, the man witnesses placed at Abu Salim on the night of the negotiations, was run to ground in West Africa the following year and flown back to Tripoli. A Libyan court sentenced him to death in a mass trial that international observers found deeply flawed, and then nothing happened, and he remained for years in detention, his secrets unheard, his sentence neither carried out nor overturned. Even the regime's reckoning, in other words, was left half-finished. Saif al-Islam, the heir, the reformer of the London interviews, was caught in the southern desert a month after his father's death, and the militia that took him refused to surrender him to anyone, not to the international court that had indicted him, not even to Tripoli. He spent years as the prisoner, and then the guest, and then the political asset of the town of Zintan. And in a twist that no novelist would risk, he did not disappear. He announced himself a candidate for president, wagering that a country exhausted by chaos might reach back toward the name it had once torn down. Earlier this year, in February of 2026, with an election finally on the calendar and his candidacy live, masked gunmen broke into his residence in Zintan in the small hours and shot him dead. He was buried before a crowd of thousands, beside one of his brothers, and no one has claimed the killing. 15 years after the pipe, the name still had enough power that someone, and we do not know who, decided Libya could not be allowed to choose it. As I speak to you tonight, Libya remains divided between rival administrations, East and West, and the national elections that were supposed to reunite it have been postponed again and again since 2021. The men who were supposed to face each other at the ballot box in April are burying one of their own instead. A whole generation of Libyans has now grown up that remembers neither the dictatorship nor the revolution, only the long argument that followed both. So stand back with me now, at the end of the evening, and look at the whole shape of it. A barefoot boy from a goat hair tent, lifted by oil and rage and a borrowed revolution to absolute power at 27. 4 decades in which he built schools with one hand and gallows with the other, gave his people houses and took their voices, survived the bombs of one American president and accepted the handshake of another century's prime ministers, and then 2 hours on an October morning in which every check he had ever removed from his country's life came back as a crowd with rifles and mobile phones. The men who killed him were, many of them, the grandsons of the Libya he had promised to liberate, and the sons of the one he had actually built. What they did to Gaddafi will haunt you, the title says, and I have tried, tonight, to earn every word of it honestly. It haunts because of what he did first, for decades, to the people who finally caught him. It haunts because of what was done to him in that hour, which no law on earth defends. And it haunts, most of all, because of what it cost everyone, the trial that never happened, the truth that never surfaced, the country that fell into the hollow he left behind. The golden pistol, as far as anyone can say for certain, has never been reliably seen again. It went up in the air outside Sirte, in a boy's fist, in the last photograph of an era, and then it slipped out of the story, the way the truth of that morning did. I would like to know, before you drift off, what this evening left with you, whether you remember watching that footage when it happened, and where in the world you were. Whether you think the trial that never happened would have changed anything, tell me in the comments, and I will read what gathers there with more care than you might expect. If the long histories are how you close your days, you know where the subscribe button lives, and it is the only lamp I will ever ask you to light. I'm Arthur. The story is yours now, to carry or to set down. May the rest of your night be gentler than the one we just walked through.